In the shadow of England's grandest estates, where bloodlines determined destiny and titles commanded reverence, an unlikely encounter would shatter the rigid boundaries of Georgian society. The Duke of Ravenshollow, master of vast lands and ancient privilege, believed his heart as impenetrable as his castle walls. Yet fate, with its peculiar sense of irony, would prove that love recognizes no rank, no station, and certainly no carefully constructed barriers between the powerful and the powerless. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning mist clung to the sprawling grounds of Ravenshollow Manor like a shroud, its tendrils weaving through the ancient oak trees that had witnessed 3 centuries of ducal succession. Alexander Whitmore, the 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, stood at the towering windows of his study, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. At 28, he possessed the refined features that generations of careful breeding had cultivated: sharp cheekbones, piercing grey eyes, and the kind of aristocratic bearing that commanded immediate deference. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a profound restlessness that no amount of privilege could satisfy. The weight of his title pressed upon his shoulders like an invisible yoke, each day predetermined by centuries of tradition and expectation. His mornings began with correspondence from estate managers, his afternoons consumed by parliamentary duties, and his evenings filled with the tedious social obligations that his position demanded. "Your Grace," came the measured voice of Pemberton, his long-time valet, as he entered with the morning's correspondence. "Lady Cordelia Ashworth and her family have arrived for the weekend. The Countess wishes to remind you of tonight's dinner arrangements." Alexander's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Lady Cordelia, beautiful, accomplished, and utterly predictable, represented everything his mother, the Dowager Duchess, deemed suitable for the future Duchess of Ravenshollow. Their engagement had been all but arranged since childhood, a union that would merge 2 of England's most powerful families and secure the Whitmore legacy for another generation. "Of course," Alexander replied, his tone betraying nothing of the suffocating sensation that gripped him whenever Cordelia's name was mentioned. "Please inform her ladyship that I shall join them presently." As Pemberton withdrew, Alexander returned his gaze to the grounds below. In the distance, beyond the manicured gardens and pristine lawns, lay the village of Little Ravenshollow, a world as foreign to him as the colonies across the Atlantic. He had ridden through its cobblestone streets countless times, acknowledging the respectful bows and curtsies of his tenants with the practiced nod of nobility, yet he had never truly seen the lives that unfolded there. The sound of approaching carriages drew his attention to the circular drive, where the Ashworth family's elaborate coach and 4 was arriving in a display of wealth and status. Lady Cordelia emerged first, her golden hair perfectly arranged beneath a fashionable bonnet, her pale blue travelling dress immaculate despite the journey. She moved with the calculated grace of a woman trained from birth to be ornamental, her every gesture designed to please and impress. Behind her came her younger brother, Viscount Reginald Ashworth, whose reputation for gambling and excess was whispered about in London's most exclusive clubs. The young man's eyes held the calculating gleam of someone perpetually seeking advantage, and Alexander had long suspected that Reginald viewed the proposed marriage as much as a financial salvation as a social triumph. "Alexander, darling," Cordelia's melodious voice carried across the entrance hall as he descended the grand staircase. She extended her gloved hand with practiced elegance, her smile as perfectly composed as a portrait. "How wonderful to see you again. Mama has been simply beside herself with excitement about this weekend. The Countess of Ashworth, a formidable woman whose ambitions were matched only by her determination, swept forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting her way. Your Grace, how magnificent Ravenshollow looks. Cordelia has been counting the days until this visit, haven't you, my dear?" As the familiar dance of pleasantries unfolded around him, Alexander felt the walls of his golden cage closing ever tighter. Each smile, each carefully chosen word, each meaningful glance between the mothers served to reinforce the inevitability of his fate. He was to marry Cordelia, produce an heir, and continue the unbroken chain of ducal succession that stretched back to the Norman conquest. That evening, as he dressed for dinner in his finest evening wear, Alexander caught sight of himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him possessed everything society deemed valuable: title, wealth, position, and prospects. Yet behind his grey eyes lay a hollowness that no amount of privilege could fill. He was 28 years old and felt as though his life had already been lived, every significant decision made by others, every path predetermined by birth and expectation. The dinner proceeded with the clockwork precision of aristocratic ritual. Cordelia, seated to his right, spoke charmingly of the London season, her upcoming charitable endeavours, and the latest fashions from Paris. She was, by every measure, the perfect Duchess-in-waiting, beautiful, well-connected, and utterly devoted to maintaining the social order that had elevated them both. "Alexander," the Countess said, during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying the weight of maternal authority, "Cordelia has been working tirelessly on the plans for the autumn charity ball. She has such wonderful ideas for supporting the local parish." "Indeed," Cordelia added, her blue eyes bright with enthusiasm, "I thought we might establish a fund for the deserving poor. Nothing too elaborate, of course. We mustn't encourage dependency, but something that demonstrates our Christian duty to those less fortunate." Alexander nodded politely, though something in her phrasing struck him as oddly distant. The deserving poor, as if poverty were a moral failing that required judgment rather than compassion. He found himself wondering about the faces behind that phrase, the real people whose lives existed beyond the comfortable abstractions of charitable committees. As the evening wore on, and the conversation turned to wedding preparations, Alexander felt an almost physical need to escape. The walls of the dining room seemed to press inward, the candlelight growing dim despite its brightness. When the ladies finally withdrew for tea, leaving the men to their port and cigars, he excused himself with a claim of urgent estate business. The night air was crisp and clean as he stepped onto the terrace, filling his lungs with the freedom that only solitude could provide. In the distance, the lights of Little Ravenshollow twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a life lived without the burden of centuries-old expectations. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself genuinely curious about what lay beyond the boundaries of his privileged existence. But tomorrow would bring new obligations, new reminders of his duty, and the ever-present pressure to fulfill the role that birth had thrust upon him. As he stood beneath the star-filled sky, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in the darkness, his real life was waiting to begin. The question that haunted him as he finally retired to his chambers was whether he would ever have the courage to reach for it. What he didn't know was that fate was already setting the stage for an encounter that would challenge everything he believed about duty, love, and the true meaning of nobility. The morning of the grand autumn ball dawned crisp and golden, with the kind of perfect weather that seemed ordained by Providence itself. Ravenshollow Manor had been transformed into a glittering showcase of aristocratic splendor, its ballroom adorned with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers that cast dancing rainbows across the polished marble floors. The finest families from across the county had gathered for what society whispered would be the most significant social event of the season, the night when the Duke of Ravenshollow would finally announce his engagement to Lady Cordelia Ashworth. Alexander stood before his dressing mirror as Pemberton made final adjustments to his formal evening wear. The midnight blue tailcoat, cut to perfection by London's finest tailor, emphasized his tall, lean frame, while the pristine white cravat and gleaming medals of his military service completed the picture of ducal magnificence. Yet beneath the polished exterior, his stomach churned with an anxiety he couldn't quite name. "Your Grace appears somewhat pale this morning," Pemberton observed, with the careful concern of a servant who had known his master since childhood. "Perhaps a bit of fresh air before the festivities begin?" Alexander nodded absently, his thoughts consumed by the weight of the evening ahead. Tonight, in front of 300 of England's most influential families, he would take the step that would seal his fate forever. The engagement announcement had been carefully orchestrated by both mothers, timed to coincide with the ball's crescendo, ensuring maximum social impact and leaving no room for retreat. "The Ashworth family seems particularly animated this morning," Pemberton continued, arranging Alexander's ceremonial sword with practiced precision. "Lady Cordelia has been in consultation with the florists since dawn, ensuring every detail meets her exacting standards." Dazed, through his window, Alexander could see the bustling activity below as servants scurried about making final preparations. Cordelia herself was visible on the terrace, directing the placement of additional floral arrangements with the commanding presence of someone born to manage great households. She looked radiant in her morning dress of pale yellow silk, her golden hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. By every objective measure she was perfect, beautiful, accomplished, and utterly devoted to the social order that had shaped them both. So why did the thought of spending his life with her fill him with such profound emptiness? The afternoon passed in a blur of final preparations and receiving early guests. Alexander moved through the familiar rituals of hospitality with practiced ease, greeting old friends and political allies with the charm that his position demanded. Yet beneath the surface, he felt like an actor playing a role in someone else's drama, speaking lines written by tradition and expectation rather than genuine feeling. As evening approached and the first carriages began arriving in earnest, the manor filled with the glittering cream of English society. Earls and countesses, viscounts and baronesses, all dressed in their finest attire, created a sea of silk and jewels that reflected the candlelight like a living constellation. The air hummed with conversation, laughter, and the subtle undercurrents of social maneuvering that characterize such gatherings. Alexander took his position in the receiving line alongside his mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess, whose steel-grey hair and imperious bearing commanded immediate respect. Beside them stood the Ashworth family, with Cordelia resplendent in a gown of ivory silk that seemed to glow in the candlelight. The dress, Alexander realized with a start, was clearly chosen to evoke thoughts of wedding attire, another carefully calculated detail in the evening's orchestrated drama. "Your Grace," murmured Lord Pembroke, one of the evening's most distinguished guests, as he passed through the line. "All of London is buzzing with anticipation for tonight's announcement. Lady Cordelia is truly a vision of perfection." Similar comments followed from guest after guest, each one adding another layer to the web of expectation that surrounded the evening. Alexander smiled and nodded appropriately, but with each passing moment, the sensation of being trapped grew stronger. He felt like a prize bull being led to auction, his value measured not in personal worth, but in bloodline and breeding potential. The dancing began promptly at 9, with Alexander leading Cordelia onto the floor for the opening waltz. She moved with ethereal grace, her steps perfectly timed to the music, her smile radiant as she gazed up at him with what appeared to be genuine affection. To the watching crowd, they must have appeared the very picture of aristocratic romance, two beautiful young people united by love and destiny. "You seem distant tonight, Alexander," Cordelia murmured as they turned through the familiar steps. "Are you nervous about the announcement?" "I confess, I can barely contain my excitement." "Forgive me," Alexander replied, forcing warmth into his voice. "The weight of the occasion, I suppose, so many expectations to fulfill." Cordelia's laugh was like silver bells, drawing admiring glances from the surrounding dancers. "Oh, darling, you needn't worry about expectations. We shall be the most envied couple in all of England. Just think of the life we'll build together. The grand houses, the important connections, the beautiful children who will carry on both our family names." Her words, meant to reassure, only deepened Alexander's sense of suffocation. She spoke of their future marriage like a business merger, cataloguing assets and advantages rather than dreams and desires. Where was the passion, the deep connection of souls that poets wrote about? Where was the love that could transform two separate lives into something greater than the sum of their parts? As the waltz concluded, and they returned to the edge of the ballroom, Alexander's mother approached with the satisfied expression of a general surveying a successful campaign. "My dear children," she announced in her carrying voice, "I believe it's time for our special moment. The guests are all assembled, and anticipation is at its peak." The Dowager Duchess raised her fan, a prearranged signal that brought the orchestra to a halt and focused every eye in the ballroom upon their small group. A hush fell over the crowd as 300 of England's most powerful people turned their attention to what they knew would be a moment of historical significance. "My dear friends," the Dowager Duchess began, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, "tonight marks a joyous occasion for both the Whitmore and Ashworth families. It is my great pleasure to announce the engagement of my son, Alexander, Duke of Ravenshollow, to the lovely Lady Cordelia Ashworth." The expected burst of applause filled the air, accompanied by calls of congratulation and the rustle of silk as ladies leaned forward to get a better view. Alexander felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, each gaze carrying its own expectation and judgment. This was the moment, the point of no return when his fate would be sealed before the most influential witnesses in the kingdom. He opened his mouth to speak the words that had been rehearsed, the gracious acceptance that would bind him forever to a life of gilded captivity. But as he looked out over the sea of expectant faces, something inside him rebelled. The words died in his throat, replaced by a crushing realization that he was about to sacrifice his soul for the sake of social convention. He began, then stopped, his voice catching in a way that sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Cordelia's smile faltered slightly, though she maintained her composure with admirable skill. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the expectant silence. The moment stretched like an eternity, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Alexander could feel his mother's sharp gaze boring into him, could sense the growing confusion and concern among the assembled guests. This was supposed to be the triumphant culmination of months of careful planning, the moment when two great families united their fortunes and secured their legacies. Instead, Alexander found himself thinking of the lights he had seen twinkling in Little Ravenshollow, of lives lived with genuine purpose and authentic feeling. He thought of the hollow conversations about deserving poor and charitable obligations, of a future mapped out in social calendars and duty calls. He thought of growing old without ever having truly lived, of dying without ever having loved with the fierce, transformative passion that made life worth living. "I cannot," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned ballroom. "I cannot in good conscience enter into an engagement based on convenience rather than genuine affection." The words fell like stones into still water, sending shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Gasps of astonishment rose from the ladies, while the gentlemen exchanged looks of profound disbelief. This simply wasn't done. Dukes didn't reject perfectly suitable brides in front of the entire social hierarchy of England. Cordelia's face went white as parchment, her carefully maintained composure cracking like fine porcelain. "Alexander, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice trembling with shock and growing humiliation. "I'm saying that you deserve better than a husband who cannot offer you his whole heart," Alexander replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the truth that had been building inside him for months. You deserve someone who loves you with passion and devotion, not someone who sees you merely as the fulfillment of social obligation. The Countess of Ashworth stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Your Grace, surely you cannot mean to humiliate my daughter in this public manner. Think of your reputation, your duty to your family name. I am thinking of it, Alexander said, turning to face the crowd that watched in stunned silence. I'm thinking that true nobility lies not in blindly following tradition, but in having the courage to choose authenticity over convenience, love over obligation. Indeed, the ballroom erupted in a chaos of whispered conversations, shocked exclamations, and the rustle of fans as ladies attempted to process what they had just witnessed. Some faces showed sympathy for Cordelia's public humiliation. Others displayed the barely concealed excitement of those witnessing a spectacular social scandal. The carefully orchestrated evening had transformed into something unprecedented. A duke publicly rejecting the very foundations of aristocratic marriage. Cordelia, her composure finally shattered, turned and fled from the ballroom, her ivory silk gown trailing behind her like the remnants of broken dreams. Her mother followed, shooting Alexander a look of pure venom, while Viscount Reginald's face darkened with the fury of someone whose financial salvation had just evaporated. Alexander's mother stood frozen, her face a mask of aristocratic control, barely containing her rage and humiliation. "You have disgraced our family name," she said in a voice like winter frost. "You have thrown away centuries of careful breeding and alliance building for what? A romantic fantasy that has no place in the real world." "Perhaps," Alexander replied, feeling lighter than he had in years, despite the chaos surrounding him. "But I would rather live one day as my authentic self than a lifetime as someone else's creation." As the guests began to disperse in clusters of animated conversation, Alexander found himself standing alone in the center of the ballroom that had been meant to celebrate his engagement. The flowers that had been arranged to honor his union now seemed to mock the ruins of his social standing. He had burned every bridge, shattered every expectation, and destroyed the carefully constructed future that had been planned for him since birth. Yet for the first time in his adult life, Alexander felt truly free. The golden cage had been opened, and though he didn't yet know where his path would lead, he knew with absolute certainty that he could never again accept a life built on anything less than genuine feeling and authentic choice. What he didn't realize was that his act of rebellion had been witnessed not only by England's social elite, but by a young woman in the village below who had been watching the manor's glittering windows and wondering what kind of life existed behind such magnificent walls. Tomorrow, fate would arrange for their paths to cross in a way that would prove that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in accepting one's predetermined destiny, but in having the strength to write a completely new story. The morning after the disastrous ball dawned grey and sombre, as if the very heavens reflected the scandal that had shaken the foundations of English society. Alexander awoke to find his world irrevocably changed. Servants whispered in corridors, his mother refused to speak to him, and urgent messages arrived hourly from family solicitors, political allies, and social acquaintances, all demanding explanations for his unprecedented breach of protocol. By noon, the drawing room had become a battlefield of recriminations. The Dowager Duchess sat rigid in her favorite chair, her steel-grey eyes blazing with a fury that 28 years of motherhood had never prepared her to contain. Across from her, Alexander stood by the window, still dressed in yesterday's formal wear, his appearance disheveled but his resolve unshaken. "Do you comprehend the magnitude of what you have done?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The Ashworth family has withdrawn from all social engagements. Lady Cordelia has taken to her bed with nervous exhaustion. Lord Pembroke has already suggested that your seat in Parliament may be reconsidered." Alexander turned from the window, his grey eyes meeting his mother's with quiet determination. "I understand perfectly, Mother. I have chosen authenticity over convenience, and I accept the consequences. Authenticity. The word dripped with disdain. You speak like a romantic poet rather than a duke. Your father would be appalled by this display of selfish sentiment. The mention of his late father struck deep, but Alexander refused to flinch. Father married for duty and spent his entire life regretting it. I remember the sadness in his eyes, the way he would stare out at the grounds as if searching for something he had lost. I will not repeat his mistakes. Before the Dowager Duchess could respond, Pemberton appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanour showing signs of strain. Your Grace, Lady Beatrice Whitmore has arrived from London. She requests an immediate audience. Alexander felt a surge of relief at the mention of his father's sister. Lady Beatrice had always been the family's unconventional member, a widow who had chosen independence over remarriage, who travelled extensively and spoke her mind with refreshing honesty. If anyone might understand his position, it would be his aunt. Lady Beatrice swept into the room like a force of nature, her travelling dress of deep burgundy wool, practical rather than fashionable, her silver hair arranged in a simple chignon that spoke of someone who valued substance over style. At 55, she possessed the kind of natural elegance that came from confidence rather than careful cultivation. "Alexander, my dear boy," she said, crossing the room to embrace him warmly. "I came as soon as I heard. The entire journey from London, I could think of nothing but how proud your father would be of your courage." The Dowager Duchess rose sharply. "Beatrice, surely you cannot approve of this catastrophe. Alexander has destroyed his reputation, humiliated a perfectly suitable young woman, and brought scandal upon our family name." Lady Beatrice turned to her sister-in-law with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with rigid thinking. "Margaret, I have spent the last 20 years travelling across Europe, meeting people from every walk of life, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the most miserable individuals I have encountered are those who married for duty rather than love. Alexander has shown remarkable wisdom in refusing to repeat that pattern." "Wisdom?" The Dowager Duchess's voice rose dangerously. "He has thrown away the most advantageous match in England for the sake of romantic nonsense. He has chosen to live authentically rather than as a prisoner of other people's expectations." Lady Beatrice replied calmly. "There is nothing nonsensical about refusing to sacrifice one's soul for social approval." Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest at his aunt's words. For the first time since the previous evening, someone understood his choice. Someone recognized that his rebellion had been born not of selfishness, but of a desperate need for genuine connection. "Aunt Beatrice," he said quietly, "I fear I may have acted rashly. The consequences are significant." Lady Beatrice studied his face with the keen perception that had made her such an astute observer of human nature. "Tell me, Alexander, in the moment when you were expected to announce your engagement, what did you feel?" Alexander closed his eyes, remembering the suffocating sensation that had gripped him as he stood before the assembled crowd. "I felt as though I was about to bury myself alive, as though I was choosing a beautiful tomb over an uncertain but authentic life." "Then you acted with perfect wisdom," Lady Beatrice declared. "The question now is what you intend to do with the freedom you have claimed." The Dowager Duchess made a sound of profound disgust. "Freedom? He has made himself a social pariah. No respectable family will receive him, no suitable woman will consider him, no political position will be offered to him. This is not freedom, it is social suicide." Lady Beatrice smiled with the confidence of someone who had seen beyond the narrow confines of English society. "Margaret, you speak as though London drawing rooms represent the entirety of human experience. There is a vast world beyond these walls, filled with people who value character over title, substance over ceremony." She turned to Alexander with growing excitement. "I have a proposition for you, my dear nephew. I own a modest house in the village of Little Ravens Hollow, a place I purchased years ago as a retreat from London society. It's simple but comfortable, and it would provide you with the solitude you need to discover who you truly are when stripped of ducal expectations. Alexander felt his pulse quicken at the suggestion. The village that had seemed so distant from his window now beckoned as a sanctuary, a place where he might learn to live as simply Alexander rather than His Grace the Duke. "You cannot be serious," the Dowager Duchess interjected. "A duke living in a village cottage like a common citizen. The very idea is preposterous." "The very idea is liberating," Lady Beatrice countered. "Alexander needs time away from the suffocating atmosphere of aristocratic expectation. He needs to discover what kind of man he is when his worth is measured by his character rather than his bloodline." Alexander found himself nodding, the prospect of escape growing more appealing with each passing moment. "How long would you suggest such a retreat?" "As long as necessary," Lady Beatrice replied, "until you have found your authentic self and decided what kind of life you wish to build. The dukedom will survive your absence. It has endured for 3 centuries and can certainly weather a few months of unconventional behavior." The Dowager Duchess rose to her full height, her face a mask of aristocratic outrage. "If you pursue this course of action, Alexander, do not expect to be welcomed back into polite society. Your reputation will be in ruins, your prospects destroyed." Alexander met his mother's gaze steadily. "Then I shall have to build new prospects based on who I am rather than what I was born to be." Within hours, the arrangements were made. Lady Beatrice's cottage in Little Raven's Hollow was prepared for occupancy, and Alexander's few personal belongings were packed with the efficiency that only a well-trained household could provide. As evening approached, he found himself standing once again at his study window, but this time looking toward the village lights with anticipation rather than longing. Pemberton appeared at his elbow, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, the carriage is ready. Lady Beatrice has provided detailed instructions for the cottage's management, and I have taken the liberty of arranging for basic provisions." Alexander turned to his faithful valet, suddenly realizing that his decision would affect more than just himself. "Pemberton, I cannot ask you to follow me into this uncertain situation. Your position here is secure, your future assured." The older man's face softened with something approaching paternal affection. "Your Grace, I have served the Whitmore family for 30 years, and I have never been more proud than I am at this moment. If you will have me, I would be honored to continue in your service, regardless of where that service might lead." As the carriage rolled down the familiar drive for what might be the last time, Alexander felt a complex mixture of grief and exhilaration. Behind him lay everything he had ever known: privilege, security, and the unquestioned respect that came with his title. Ahead lay uncertainty, potential hardship, and the daunting prospect of discovering who he might become when stripped of everything that had defined him. The cottage that awaited him was indeed modest. A stone structure with ivy-covered walls, diamond-paned windows, and a garden that spoke of careful tending rather than professional landscaping. Inside, the rooms were small but comfortable, furnished with pieces that prioritized function over grandeur. For the first time in his life, Alexander found himself in a space designed for living rather than impressing. That first night, as he sat before a simple fire in the cottage's main room, Alexander reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. 24 hours ago, he had been the Duke of Ravenshollow, master of vast estates and heir to centuries of tradition. Tonight, he was simply a man seeking to understand himself, surrounded by the quiet sounds of village life rather than the formal protocols of aristocratic society. Through the cottage windows, he could see the warm glow of lights in neighboring houses, each one representing lives lived with purpose and authenticity. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of discovering what lay beyond the golden cage of his birth. He would learn to live as Alexander rather than His Grace, to earn respect through character rather than inherit it through bloodline. What he didn't yet know was that his journey toward authentic living would soon intersect with that of a remarkable young woman whose own struggles with social expectations would prove that courage and dignity were not the exclusive province of the aristocracy. In seeking to escape the confines of his privileged prison, Alexander was about to discover that the most profound nobility often resided in the most unexpected places. 3 months had passed since Alexander's retreat to the cottage in Little Ravenshollow, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The pale, restless duke who had fled his gilded cage had been replaced by a man whose hands bore the honest calluses of physical labor, whose face had been bronzed by daily walks through the countryside, and whose eyes held a peace that no amount of aristocratic privilege had ever provided. The cottage had become more than a refuge. It had become a laboratory for authentic living. Alexander had dismissed most of the formal protocols that had governed his previous existence, choosing instead to tend his own garden, prepare simple meals, and engage with the village community as a neighbor rather than a lord. The experience had been both humbling and profoundly liberating. On this particular morning, Alexander was returning from the village market, his arms laden with fresh bread and seasonal vegetables, when he encountered a scene that would forever alter the trajectory of his new life. Near the old stone bridge that marked the village center, a young woman knelt beside an overturned cart, desperately trying to gather scattered apples that rolled across the cobblestones like wayward children. She was perhaps 22 years old, with auburn hair that caught the morning sunlight like burnished copper, and green eyes that sparkled with unshed tears of frustration. Her dress was simple but clean, a practical garment of blue wool that spoke of modest means but careful maintenance. What struck Alexander most profoundly was not her undeniable beauty, but the dignity with which she faced her predicament, refusing to surrender to despair despite the obvious magnitude of her loss. "Please allow me to help," Alexander said, setting down his own purchases and immediately beginning to gather the scattered fruit. The young woman looked up, her green eyes widening with surprise at his refined accent and gentle manner. "Oh, sir, you needn't trouble yourself. I can manage." "Nonsense," Alexander replied, his voice warm with genuine concern. "Many hands make light work, as they say." And together they worked to salvage what they could of her merchandise, though it quickly became apparent that much of the fruit had been damaged beyond sale. As they worked, Alexander found himself stealing glances at his companion, struck by the grace with which she moved, despite her obvious distress, the way she thanked him for each rescued apple as though it were a precious gem. "I'm Alexander," he said, as they placed the last of the salvageable fruit back into her cart. "Alexander Whitmore." "T. Eleanor Hartwell," she replied, offering a small curtsy that spoke of good breeding despite her humble circumstances. "I cannot thank you enough for your kindness, Mr. Whitmore. Most gentlemen would have passed by without a second glance." Alexander felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words, at the genuine gratitude that lit her features. When had anyone last thanked him with such heartfelt sincerity? In his previous life, gratitude had been a formal obligation, expressed through proper channels and appropriate protocols. This was something entirely different, human connection in its purest form. "The fault was mine for not arriving sooner," he said, studying the damaged cartwheel that had caused the accident. "This wheel is beyond immediate repair, I'm afraid. Please allow me to escort you home and arrange for proper assistance." Eleanor's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, I couldn't possibly impose further. You've already been far too kind." "It would be my pleasure," Alexander insisted, and realized with surprise that he meant it completely. "Besides, I've been seeking ways to be useful to the community. This seems like an excellent opportunity." As they walked through the village streets, Eleanor pushing her damaged cart while Alexander carried the heavier items, she began to share her story. She lived with her elderly grandmother in a small cottage on the village outskirts, supporting them both through the sale of fruit from their modest orchard. Her parents had died in a fever epidemic 3 years prior, leaving her to care for her grandmother and maintain their small property with determination that bordered on fierce. "The apples are our primary income," she explained, her voice tinged with worry. "Grandmother's health prevents her from working, and the orchard requires constant attention. Today's loss—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the full extent of her concern. Alexander felt his heart constrict at the quiet desperation beneath her composed exterior. Here was someone facing genuine hardship, with a courage that put his own previous struggles into perspective. His rebellion against social expectations seemed almost trivial compared to Eleanor's daily battle for survival. "Perhaps I might purchase the damaged fruit," he suggested carefully, not wanting to wound her pride with obvious charity. "I've been experimenting with preserves and jellies, a hobby I've recently taken up. The bruised apples would be perfect for such purposes." Eleanor stopped walking, her green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made Alexander feel as though she could see directly into his soul. "Mr. Whitmore, you are very kind, but I cannot accept charity disguised as commerce." Her directness was both refreshing and challenging. In his previous life, such conversations would have been conducted through layers of social protocol and diplomatic language. Eleanor's honesty demanded equal authenticity in return. "You're quite right," Alexander admitted, feeling a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "I was attempting to help without acknowledging that I was helping. Perhaps we might simply call it what it is, one neighbor assisting another in a time of need." For a moment, Eleanor studied him with those remarkable green eyes, and Alexander felt as though he were being evaluated by someone whose judgment mattered more than any social arbiter he had ever encountered. Finally, she smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face and made Alexander's heart skip in a way that was entirely new to his experience. "In that case, Mr. Whitmore, I accept your assistance with gratitude. But I insist on providing you with preserves once they're made. One neighbor helping another, as you said." And the cottage where Eleanor lived with her grandmother was indeed modest, a stone structure similar to Alexander's own retreat, but showing signs of careful maintenance despite obvious financial constraints. The garden was meticulously tended, with vegetables growing in neat rows and fruit trees that spoke of years of patient cultivation. Eleanor's grandmother, Mrs. Hartwell, proved to be a woman of remarkable spirit, despite her frail health. Her eyes, the same striking green as her granddaughter's, held a sharpness that suggested a keen intelligence and a lifetime of observing human nature. "Eleanor, dear, you've brought a visitor," she said from her chair by the window, her voice carrying the refined accents of someone who had once moved in more elevated circles. "How lovely." As introductions were made and tea was served in delicate china that spoke of better days, Alexander found himself drawn into conversation that was both stimulating and genuine. Mrs. Hartwell had been a governess in her younger years, teaching the children of wealthy families before marrying Eleanor's grandfather, a village schoolmaster. Her education and experience had given her perspectives that transcended social boundaries. "You have the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, Mr. Whitmore," she observed with the directness that seemed to run in the family. "Yet you speak with the humility of someone who has learned that true worth cannot be inherited." Alexander felt a start of surprise at her perceptiveness. "You're very observant, Mrs. Hartwell. When one has spent a lifetime watching people, patterns become apparent," she replied with a knowing smile. "Eleanor, dear, why don't you show Mr. Whitmore the orchard? I believe he might appreciate seeing the source of our famous apples." The orchard was a testament to years of careful cultivation, with rows of apple trees that showed the kind of attention that came from genuine love rather than mere commercial interest. As they walked between the trees, Eleanor spoke passionately about different varieties, optimal harvesting techniques, and her dreams of expanding their small operation. "You speak of these trees as though they were family," Alexander observed, charmed by her enthusiasm. "In many ways they are," Eleanor replied, her hand resting gently on the bark of a particularly large tree. "My grandfather planted most of these when my father was young. Each tree represents years of hope and patience, seasons of growth and harvest. They've sustained our family through good times and difficult ones." Alexander found himself deeply moved by her connection to the land, by the way she spoke of continuity and legacy in terms that had nothing to do with titles or inherited wealth. This was nobility of a different sort, the dignity that came from honest work, genuine care, and authentic connection to something larger than oneself. As the afternoon progressed, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave. The conversation flowed naturally between them, touching on everything from literature to philosophy to the changing seasons. Eleanor possessed an education that surprised him. Her grandmother had clearly been an excellent teacher, but more than that, she had a wisdom that came from facing life's challenges with courage and grace. "I should return before dark," he said finally, though every instinct urged him to stay longer. "Of course," Eleanor replied, though he thought he detected a note of disappointment in her voice. "Thank you again for your kindness today, Mr. Whitmore. Your help meant more than you know." As Alexander walked back to his cottage through the gathering dusk, he felt as though he had awakened from a long sleep. The encounter with Eleanor had stirred something within him that he had never experienced, a connection that transcended social boundaries and touched something fundamental in his soul. For the first time in his life, he understood what poets meant when they wrote of love that transformed rather than merely pleased. The following weeks brought a series of encounters that seemed orchestrated by fate itself. Alexander found reasons to visit the village market more frequently, always hoping to catch a glimpse of Eleanor with her cart of fresh fruit. When they met, their conversations grew longer and more intimate, covering topics that ranged from practical matters to philosophical discussions that revealed the depth of her intelligence and the breadth of her compassion. Eleanor, for her part, seemed equally drawn to these encounters. Alexander noticed how her face would light up when she saw him approaching, how she would save the finest apples for his purchase, how their conversations would continue long after the commercial transaction was complete. There was a growing warmth between them that spoke of mutual attraction and deepening affection. One morning, as Alexander was purchasing his usual selection of fruit, Eleanor surprised him with an invitation. "Mr. Whitmore, Grandmother has been asking about you. She wondered if you might join us for Sunday dinner. Nothing elaborate, of course, but she enjoys stimulating conversation. And she says you remind her of someone she once knew." Alexander accepted with an eagerness that surprised him, and Sunday dinner at the Hartwell cottage became a weekly tradition that he anticipated with growing excitement. The meals were simple but delicious, the conversation was engaging and authentic, and the warmth of genuine human connection filled a void in his soul that he hadn't even realized existed. It was during one of these dinners that Mrs. Hartwell made an observation that would prove prophetic. "Mr. Whitmore," she said as they sat by the fire after the meal, "you have the look of a man who has found something precious that he thought was lost forever." Alexander met her knowing gaze, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "I believe you may be right, Mrs. Hartwell." "Good," she replied with satisfaction. "Eleanor deserves someone who recognizes her true worth, someone who values character over circumstance." What none of them realized was that their growing happiness was being observed by eyes that viewed it with growing alarm and calculation. Word of the mysterious gentleman who had taken residence in Lady Beatrice's cottage was beginning to spread, and certain individuals from Alexander's past were beginning to take notice of his new circumstances. The peaceful interlude that had allowed love to blossom was about to be tested by forces that would challenge everything Alexander and Eleanor had begun to build together. The question that hung in the air like morning mist was whether their connection was strong enough to withstand the storm that was gathering on the horizon. and whether love born of authentic feeling could triumph over the machinations of those who viewed human relationships as mere tools for social and financial advancement. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon finally broke on a crisp October morning, when an elegant carriage bearing the Ashworth family crest rolled through the cobblestone streets of Little Ravenshollow. Alexander was in Eleanor's orchard, helping with the final apple harvest of the season, when Pemberton arrived with news that would shatter the peaceful world they had built together. "Your Grace," Pemberton said, his usually composed demeanour showing signs of strain, "Lady Cordelia Ashworth and her brother have arrived at your cottage. They are most insistent on speaking with you immediately." Alexander felt his blood turn to ice. For 6 months, he had lived as simply Alexander Whitmore, a gentleman of modest means who had found love in the most unexpected place. The arrival of his former life in the form of Cordelia and Reginald Ashworth threatened to destroy everything he had discovered about himself and the woman who had captured his heart. Eleanor, who had been sorting apples nearby, looked up with concern at the sudden tension in Alexander's posture. "Is everything all right, Alexander?" The use of his given name, spoken with such natural affection, reminded Alexander of how much he had to lose. In Eleanor's presence, he had become the man he was meant to be, not a duke bound by duty and expectation, but a human being capable of genuine love and authentic connection. "I'm afraid I have visitors from my previous circumstances," Alexander said carefully, not wanting to reveal the full extent of his deception until he could find the right words. "Perhaps it would be best if I handled this matter privately." Eleanor's green eyes searched his face with the perceptiveness that had drawn him to her from their first meeting. "Alexander, you look as though you've seen a ghost. Whatever this is about, surely it cannot be so terrible." Before Alexander could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of the very people he had hoped never to see again. Cordelia Ashworth appeared at the orchard gate, resplendent in a travelling dress of deep blue velvet that spoke of wealth and status. Behind her came Reginald, his face bearing the calculating expression that Alexander remembered all too well. "Alexander!" Cordelia called out, her voice carrying the musical quality that had once charmed London society. "How rustic you've become! We've been searching everywhere for you." Eleanor stepped closer to Alexander, her instincts clearly alerting her to the threat these elegant strangers represented. Alexander felt a surge of protectiveness toward her, coupled with a growing dread about what Cordelia's presence might mean for their future. "Lady Cordelia," Alexander said formally, his voice carefully controlled, "this is unexpected. May I present Miss Eleanor Hartwell? Eleanor, this is Lady Cordelia Ashworth, and her brother, Viscount Reginald Ashworth." Eleanor offered a polite curtsy, but Alexander could see the questions forming in her intelligent eyes. The formal titles, the obvious wealth of his visitors, the sudden change in Alexander's demeanour, all of it pointed to secrets that he had not yet shared. Cordelia's gaze swept over Eleanor with the kind of assessment that reduced people to their social utility. "How charming," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Alexander always did have a fondness for pastoral diversions. The condescension in her tone made Alexander's jaw tighten with anger. "Miss Hartwell is not a diversion, Lady Cordelia. She is a remarkable woman who has shown me what genuine worth looks like." Reginald stepped forward, his eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "Come now, Alexander, surely you don't expect us to believe that the Duke of Ravenshollow has developed serious feelings for a village fruit seller?" The words fell like a physical blow. Eleanor's face went white as the full implications of Reginald's statement sank in. Alexander saw the moment when understanding dawned in her eyes. The realization that the man she had come to love was not simply Alexander Whitmore, but one of England's most powerful noblemen. "Duke?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "Alexander, is this true?" Alexander felt his world crumbling around him. The peaceful months of authentic living, the growing love between them, the hope for a future built on genuine feeling, all of it threatened by the revelation of his true identity. "Eleanor, I can explain," he began, but she stepped back, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. "You're the Duke of Ravenshollow," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The man who publicly humiliated Lady Cordelia at their engagement ball. The scandal that was whispered about in every drawing room in England." Cordelia's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear girl, surely you didn't think a duke would seriously consider marrying someone of your station? Alexander has always been prone to romantic fantasies, but even he understands the realities of social position." "That's enough," Alexander said sharply, his protective instincts overriding his shock at the situation. "You will not speak to Miss Hartwell in that manner." But the damage was done. Eleanor's eyes, which had always looked at him with such warmth and trust, now held a mixture of hurt and anger that cut him to the bone. "You lied to me," she said quietly. "For months, you let me believe you are someone you're not." "I never lied about who I am," Alexander protested desperately. "I simply didn't tell you about a title that means nothing to me. The man you've come to know, that's who I really am." Eleanor shook her head, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "The man I thought I knew wouldn't have built our entire relationship on a foundation of deception. A duke, Alexander. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? How foolish I feel?" Reginald, sensing an opportunity to twist the knife deeper, stepped forward with false sympathy. "Miss Hartwell, surely you understand that men of Alexander's position often seek entertainment in the countryside. It's quite common, really. Nothing to be ashamed of." The implication in his words made Alexander see red. "How dare you suggest—" "Stop!" Eleanor said, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "Just stop! All of you!" She turned to face Alexander, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and dignity that made his heart ache. "Your Grace, I thank you for your attention these past months, but I think it's time you return to your proper sphere." The formal address, spoken with such cold politeness, was more devastating than any angry outburst could have been. Alexander watched helplessly as Eleanor gathered her skirts and walked away, her back straight with the kind of pride that no amount of noble breeding could instill. "Eleanor, please!" he called after her, but she didn't turn around. Cordelia moved to his side, her hand resting possessively on his arm. "Really, Alexander, you've had your little adventure. Now it's time to return to reality. The scandal of our broken engagement has died down, and society is prepared to welcome you back. We could even consider renewing our understanding if you're prepared to behave more appropriately." Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "You think I would return to that life? After everything that's happened? What choice do you have?" Reginald interjected pragmatically. "You've had your rustic romance, but surely you realize it could never lead to anything permanent. A duke cannot marry a village girl. The very idea is preposterous." "The only thing preposterous," Alexander said with growing conviction, "is the idea that I would abandon the woman I love for the sake of social convention." Cordelia's composure finally cracked. "Love, Alexander, you cannot be serious. She's a nobody. A fruit seller with no family, no connections, no dowry. What could she possibly offer you that I cannot?" "Authenticity," Alexander replied without hesitation. "Genuine affection, the kind of love that sees the man rather than the title." "And what will you live on?" Reginald demanded. "Romantic sentiment. Your mother has made it clear that continued defiance will result in complete disinheritance. You'll have nothing, no income, no property, no position in society." For a moment, Alexander felt the weight of what he would be giving up. The vast estates, the political influence, the security that came with his birthright, all of it would be forfeit if he chose love over duty. But as he thought of Eleanor's smile, of the peace he had found in their simple life together, of the man he had become in her presence, the choice became clear. "Then I'll have nothing," he said simply, "but I'll have it with the woman I love, and that will be everything." Cordelia stared at him in shock, finally understanding that her power over him was completely broken. "You're making the greatest mistake of your life, Alexander. When this infatuation fades, you'll have nothing left but regret." "Perhaps," Alexander acknowledged, "but I'd rather risk everything for authentic love than settle for a lifetime of comfortable emptiness." As Cordelia and Reginald departed in their elegant carriage, their faces masks of frustrated ambition, Alexander stood alone in the orchard where he had found such happiness. The woman he loved was gone, driven away by the revelation of his deception, and the life he had built lay in ruins around him. But even in his despair, Alexander knew he had made the right choice. He had chosen authenticity over convenience, love over obligation, and the possibility of genuine happiness over the certainty of gilded misery. Now he had to find a way to convince Eleanor that his feelings were real, that the man she had fallen in love with was his true self, regardless of the title he bore. The question that haunted him as he walked back to his cottage was whether love could survive the revelation of secrets, whether trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, and whether a duke and a village girl could find a way to bridge the vast chasm that society had placed between them. The answer would determine not just his future, but the very meaning of everything he had discovered about himself in the months since he had chosen freedom over duty. What he didn't yet know was that Eleanor, despite her hurt and anger, was struggling with her own feelings, torn between the betrayal she felt and the undeniable truth that the man she had loved was still the same person, regardless of his title. The coming days would test whether their connection was strong enough to overcome the barriers that birth and circumstance had placed between them, and whether love could truly conquer the rigid expectations of a society that viewed their union as impossible. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in the orchard, and the small village of Little Ravenshollow had become the unlikely stage for one of the most extraordinary love stories in English history. What had begun as a scandal that rocked the foundations of aristocratic society had transformed into something far more profound, a testament to the power of authentic love to transcend the rigid boundaries of birth and circumstance. The transformation had not been easy or immediate. In the weeks following Cordelia's devastating revelation, Eleanor had retreated into herself, her pride wounded and her trust shattered by what she perceived as Alexander's fundamental deception. She continued her daily routines, tending the orchard, caring for her grandmother, selling fruit at the village market, but the joy that had illuminated her features during their courtship had dimmed to a shadow of its former brightness. Alexander, meanwhile, had faced his own crucible of decision. True to Reginald's warning, the Dowager Duchess had made good on her threat of disinheritance. Official documents had arrived from London, formally stripping him of his inheritance and severing his connection to the vast Ravenshollow estates. He was no longer the Duke of Ravenshollow in anything but name, a title that now carried no wealth, no property, and no political influence. Yet rather than crushing his spirit, the loss had proven liberating in ways he had never anticipated. Free from the burden of managing vast estates and fulfilling endless social obligations, Alexander had thrown himself into the kind of honest work that his privileged upbringing had never allowed him to experience. He had apprenticed himself to the village blacksmith, learning to shape metal with his own hands. He had worked alongside farmers during harvest season, discovering the satisfaction that came from physical labor and tangible results. The villagers, initially suspicious of the fallen duke in their midst, had gradually come to accept and even respect him. They had watched him struggle with unfamiliar tasks, seen him persist through failures and setbacks, and witnessed his genuine desire to contribute to their community rather than simply exist within it. Alexander Whitmore, former Duke of Ravenshollow, had earned his place among them through character rather than birthright. But the greatest challenge remained Eleanor herself. despite his repeated attempts to explain his actions, to convince her that his feelings had been genuine regardless of his concealed identity. She had maintained a polite but distant demeanor that broke his heart daily. She would acknowledge his presence with a courteous nod, accept his payment for fruit with professional politeness, but the warmth that had once existed between them seemed as distant as the stars. It was Mrs. Hartwell who finally provided the catalyst for change. The elderly woman had watched her granddaughter's growing unhappiness with the keen perception of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between wounded pride and genuine heartbreak. "Eleanor, dear," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, "you're punishing yourself more than you're punishing him." Eleanor looked up from her needlework, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "I don't know what you mean, grandmother." "Of course you do," Mrs. Hartwell replied gently. "You're in love with that man, title or no title. The question is whether you're going to let pride prevent you from claiming the happiness you both deserve." "He lied to me," Eleanor said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried months earlier. "Did he?" Mrs. Hartwell asked thoughtfully. "Or did he simply fail to mention a circumstance that he was trying to escape? Tell me, dear, in all your conversations, did he ever claim to be someone he wasn't?" Eleanor considered the question, her needle pausing in its work. In truth, Alexander had never fabricated stories about his background or pretended to be someone else. He had simply omitted the detail of his ducal status, allowing her to assume he was a gentleman of modest means rather than one of England's most powerful noblemen. "He let me make assumptions," Eleanor said finally. "And were those assumptions about his character or his circumstances?" Mrs. Hartwell pressed gently. "Because it seems to me that everything you learned about his heart, his kindness, his integrity, all of that was perfectly true." The conversation planted a seed of doubt in Eleanor's mind, a growing recognition that perhaps her anger was directed more at the situation than at the man himself. Over the following days, she found herself observing Alexander with new eyes, watching as he worked alongside the village men, noting how he treated everyone with the same respect and kindness he had shown her. The turning point came during the village's annual harvest festival, a celebration that brought the entire community together in a display of rural solidarity and shared joy. Alexander had volunteered to help with the preparations, working tirelessly to erect booths, arrange displays, and ensure that every detail contributed to the festival's success. Eleanor was arranging her own display of preserved fruits and jellies when she noticed a commotion near the festival's entrance. A group of elegantly dressed strangers had arrived, their fine clothes and haughty demeanor marking them as visitors from London society. At their head stood a woman Eleanor recognized from descriptions she had heard, Lady Cordelia Ashworth, more beautiful and imperious than ever. "How quaint," Cordelia was saying to her companions, her voice carrying clearly across the festival grounds. "A rustic celebration. I suppose this is what passes for entertainment in the countryside." Alexander appeared at Eleanor's side, his face tense with concern. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I had hoped they wouldn't follow me here." Eleanor studied his profile, noting the genuine distress in his expression. This was not a man who welcomed the intrusion of his former life into his new one. This was someone who had found peace and purpose in simplicity, only to have it threatened by the very world he had rejected. "Why have they come?" Eleanor asked, her voice softer than it had been in months. "Cordelia believes she can convince me to return," Alexander replied. "She thinks this is all a temporary madness that will pass with time." As if summoned by their conversation, Cordelia approached their booth, her eyes taking in Eleanor's display with barely concealed disdain. "Miss Hartwell, how industrious of you." "Alexander, surely you've had enough of this rustic charade. It's time to return to civilization." "This is civilization," Alexander replied firmly. "This is a community of people who value honesty, hard work, and genuine human connection. I've never been more civilized in my life." Cordelia's laugh was like breaking crystal. "You cannot be serious. Look around you, Alexander. These people are beneath you in every way that matters. You're a duke, for heaven's sake. You belong in drawing rooms and parliament, not at country fairs selling preserves." "I belong wherever I choose to be," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength. "And I choose to be here, among people who judge me by my character rather than my bloodline." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest as she listened to Alexander's words. Here was a man who had given up everything: wealth, position, social standing, for the sake of authentic living. He had chosen poverty over privilege, honest work over inherited ease, and the respect of common people over the deference of aristocrats. "How touching," Cordelia said with venomous sweetness. "But what happens when the novelty wears off? When you tire of playing at being common? What then, Alexander?" "Then I'll continue to live as the man I've chosen to become," Alexander replied without hesitation. "Because this isn't a game or a temporary rebellion. This is who I really am when I'm free to choose for myself." Eleanor stepped forward, surprising herself with her sudden boldness. "Lady Cordelia, I believe you're mistaken about something fundamental." Cordelia turned to her with raised eyebrows, clearly not expecting to be addressed by someone she considered so far beneath her station. "You speak as though Alexander is pretending to be something he's not," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I've watched him these past months, and I can tell you with certainty that he's never been more himself than he is right now. The man who works alongside our farmers, who helps our elderly neighbors, who treats every person with dignity and respect, that's not an act. That's who he truly is when he's free from the expectations that others have placed upon him." Alexander stared at Eleanor in amazement, hearing in her words not just a defense of his character, but a recognition of the man he had struggled to become. For the first time in months, he saw something other than hurt in her green eyes. He saw understanding, and perhaps even the beginning of forgiveness. Cordelia's composure finally cracked completely. "You foolish girl. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? He could give you everything: wealth, position, a place in society that you could never achieve on your own." "He already has given me everything," Eleanor replied with quiet dignity. "He's shown me what it means to love someone for who they are, rather than what they possess. That's worth more than all the wealth and position in England." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and Alexander felt his heart soar with a hope he had thought lost forever. Eleanor had not just defended him, she had declared her love, publicly and without reservation, in front of the very people who represented everything she was rejecting. Cordelia stared at them both for a long moment, her face a mask of frustrated ambition and wounded pride. Finally, she turned on her heel and stalked away, her London companions trailing behind her like the remnants of a retreating army. Alexander and Eleanor stood alone amid the bustle of the harvest festival, the noise and celebration fading into background as they faced each other across the months of hurt and misunderstanding that had separated them. "Eleanor," Alexander said softly, "I should have told you about my title from the beginning. I was wrong to let you discover it the way you did." "You were protecting something precious," Eleanor replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You were protecting the man you had become, the life you had built. I understand that now." "Can you forgive me?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Eleanor stepped forward and placed her hand in his, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones in a gesture that spoke of acceptance, forgiveness, and renewed love. The festival continued around them, but Alexander and Eleanor were lost in their own world of reconciliation and rediscovered joy. They had faced the ultimate test of their love, the revelation of secrets, the pressure of social expectations, and the interference of those who sought to keep them apart, and they had emerged stronger than ever. 3 months later, on a crisp winter morning, Alexander Whitmore and Eleanor Hartwell were married in the small village church of Little Ravens Hollow. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, attended by the entire village community that had embraced them both. Lady Beatrice served as Alexander's family representative, her eyes bright with tears of joy as she watched her nephew claim the happiness he had fought so hard to achieve. The cottage that had served as Alexander's refuge became their first home, filled with the laughter and love that only authentic partnership could provide. Alexander continued his work as the village blacksmith, his hands growing ever more skilled at shaping metal into useful forms. Eleanor expanded their orchard operation, her preserves and jellies becoming famous throughout the county for their exceptional quality. They were not wealthy by aristocratic standards, but they were rich in all the ways that truly mattered. Their love had been tested by scandal, separation, and social pressure, yet it had emerged purified and strengthened like gold refined by fire. As for those who had tried to prevent their union, fate had its own justice to dispense. Cordelia eventually married a wealthy but cold-hearted earl who valued her beauty but cared nothing for her happiness. Reginald's gambling debts finally caught up with him, forcing him to flee to the continent to escape his creditors. The Dowager Duchess, isolated in her grand manor with only her pride for company, gradually came to realize that she had sacrificed her relationship with her son for the sake of social conventions that ultimately meant nothing. But Alexander and Eleanor, blooming where they had chosen to plant themselves, created a life of such authentic joy and purpose that their story became legend in the village and beyond. They proved that true nobility lay not in inherited titles or accumulated wealth, but in the courage to choose love over convention, authenticity over expectation, and the difficult path of genuine happiness over the easy road of social approval. Their love story became a beacon of hope for others who dared to dream that happiness could be found outside the rigid boundaries of birth and circumstance, that two hearts united in genuine affection could overcome any obstacle that society might place in their path. In choosing each other, Alexander and Eleanor had not just found personal happiness, they had redefined what it meant to live a truly noble life. If this story of love conquering social barriers has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, romance, and the triumph of authentic feeling over social convention. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between duty and love? What would you have done in Alexander's position? Your stories and perspectives make our community richer, so please join the conversation and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Until next time, remember that true nobility comes not from what we inherit, but from what we choose to become.